Great. Hi.
Hey, everyone.
This is amazing. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you, Teresa, for that introduction.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. How cool is this? So Robin and I were thinking that we're going to just have a conversation up here. We're going to ask each other some questions, and then when we're done with that, we'll of course turn and get all of your questions for us. But we're going to tell you how we got to this stage here today. So we're going to tell you about our writing journey. Let's dive in. Robin, tell us about your writing journey. Did you always want to be a writer?
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. So I grew up in Miami, Florida, to immigrant parents. My father from the Dominican Republic and my mom from Ecuador. And they met in the US Army, fell in love, got married, and had my sister all in the same calendar year, 1980. So the math was interesting growing up. But we were working class. My father was a public school teacher, and my mother was a mail carrier. So I was left to my own devices a lot. And left to my own devices, I mainly did three things. I studied, I watched a lot of TV, and I was always writing. And I distinctly recall, as a kid on the playground, while others were sort of running around, playing, I was tucked in a corner with my nose in a notebook, scribbling away, spinning tales. And I even recall the pride I felt when the teacher yelled out to everyone somewhat exasperatingly, "Why can't you all be quiet like Robin?" So that was in grade school. And then in middle school, I forced my friends to get together and act out and record a screenplay I had written, and usually it was horror. And in high school, I put out semi-weekly chapters featuring my friend group as the characters. And I had my best friend, my first beta reader, read them and tell me what she thought of them. So it's just always been my first love, the written word. I graduated from high school, and I gave my first speech as the valedictorian of my high school. So that's when I, was able to translate my written word into conveying it to people for the first time. And I went off to college at Harvard, came down after college to Washington, D.C. I had been doing newspaper throughout high school and throughout college. And I applied and did not get an internship at the New York Times, and I was like, this is maybe a sign. So I was like, I got an offer to go to Congress, to work for Congress in DC, and I decided to go and do that. But it was always still involving writing. I worked for Congressman Charlie Rangel from New York. He was the first Black chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, doing press for him. And I also worked for Amy Klobuchar as her speechwriter, senator from Minnesota. Hopefully some fans. I don't know, some rumors with Senator Klobuchar's mention. But government work can be really slow, and you don't really see the fruits of your labor in real time sometimes. And so I wanted to have that. I wanted to see the work that I was doing help real people in real time. So after my 4 years on the Hill, I went to law school, again at Harvard, and then I moved down to Miami, back where I was from, so that I could become a prosecutor. And I worked as a criminal prosecutor for 7 years, the last 3 of which I worked as a criminal homicide prosecutor. And so then I was there for 7 years, and it wasn't but for a year and a half ago that I got the opportunity to come back to Washington, D.C., this time not as a 21-year-old kid right out of college, but a full-fledged adult, which was nice, to work on the January 6th committee. So that's what I did up until, thank you, appreciate it. So I was a lawyer for the committee up until, it ended with this last Congress, and that was, historic and meaningful and really a real joy to be a part of that. And once our work ended in the last Congress, I stayed on Capitol Hill, and so currently I'm the chief of staff for a member of Congress. So I'm living in Washington, D.C. now, and it's so nice to come down and be here with you guys. But throughout it all, I was always writing. So even as I have my day job, I still write, and it's because it's what brings me joy. It's what I do on the nights, on the weekends. It's it's not a chore, it's not a task, it's not a job for me. So I've always been a writer first, and anything else, lawyer second. What about you, Ashley?
Yeah, well, how to follow that? I will say we have a lot in common in terms of our childhoods, actually, because my parents met in the Navy, and I was a military kid, and a lot of how you described yourself feels achingly familiar. I was intensely shy as a kid. Like, I have a very vivid memory of being young, like a year of my life, a vivid memory of my own 2 feet against the linoleum floor. Because for about a year, I just stared down at my feet and couldn't make eye contact. So just intensely shy. And about the worst thing that can happen to a really shy kid is to have to pack up and move every 2 years, which is about what we did with my father's Navy assignments. So just when I was working up the courage to raise my hand in class, it would be time to pack up and move to a new school. And so I also experienced some issues with bullying as a kid because I was that super silent, quiet girl who was also, weirdly good at school and would get attention from teachers. Teachers were usually my friends, my only friends. And so I can totally see why I was the target, the subject of a little bit of bullying growing up. And what you said about being the quiet kid in the corner really resonated with me, because if you can picture like a park somewhere, well, specifically on a Navy base, and my 3 siblings, all well-adjusted, friendly, even popular kids, running around with other kids, and then pan over to a tree, pan up the tree, and there I am, sitting curled in a branch with my book at the park so that I can report to my mom that I did, in fact, go to the park and play with the other kids, but I was reading books. So needless to say, books were my refuge. They were my home that I carried with me throughout the world. Maybe we would be moving every 2 years, but Sweet Valley High was always going to be in the same place, right? I might not have any friends, but in lieu of a social life, Jessica and Elizabeth Wakefield were always going to be there. The Babysitters Club, they were always going to be there. So reading became my identity as a kid. And it wasn't like long after that writing really became my identity. I have a very visceral memory of being young, like 7, 8 years old, and getting a homework assignment that I'm sure my teacher meant as like a throwaway. We're just gonna do this tonight. It's like write 2 paragraphs about describing a ship sailing on a stormy sea. You would have thought I was up for the Pulitzer or something with the amount of intensity I applied to this. I paced around my room with my hands behind my back, thinking about how I was gonna write this, thinking about how I could structure sentences to maybe mimic the sounds of waves hitting against the shore, the hull of a boat. I was just so fascinated at an early age by language and what language could do. And so, naturally, I decided that I wanted to be a poet. And this, again, just became like the core of who I was. Ashley Winstead, quiet, she won't talk, she wants to be a writer, and she wants to be a poet. And so I ended up, for a long time, everything was on track for that. I ended up being the first person in my family to go to college, and I majored in poetry. So you can see the wheels starting to come off this project already. And things went great. I got into a great school. I was studying with really great writing teachers at Vanderbilt, which had a wonderful writing program. And at Vanderbilt, I met a woman named Lorraine Lopez, who was just an incredible short story writer. And she became a mentor to me, and I dropped poetry quickly and thought, okay, short stories. that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to subsist as a short story writer. And as my honors thesis, I wrote a collection of short stories. I look back on that now, and I look back on that collection of early work. And I wrote 12 interlocked short stories, all from the perspective of a man, all from the perspective of normally really a middle-aged men. One of my 12 stories was from the perspective of a woman, and in fact, I wrote one story about a middle-aged male professor who had a midlife crisis, and in doing so had an affair with a young female college student. Not once did I ever consider writing from the perspective of the young female college student. That was where I was at. I was so shaped by what I had spent my life reading in academia, right? The canon, the great writers. I thought, oh, literature, good literary fiction, that's about men, middle-aged men. So if I want to be a writer and I want to participate in this tradition, that's who I'm going to write about. And I asked Lorraine Lopez, I asked my mentor, what should I do next? Okay, I've written this honors thesis. It was well received. Everyone, my mostly male professors enjoyed this collection. What do I do next? And she said, go get an MFA, right? Because this is what you do in the kind of like academic writing track. So I set out and I applied to 12 different MFA programs, best programs in the country. And 1 month before applications were due, I was involved in a very serious car accident. I lost the use of my hand, my right hand, my dominant hand, and I had serious neck injury. I had to drop out of college for a little while and wear a neck brace and focus on physical therapy and regaining the use of my hand. And I still filled those MFA applications out under the influence of painkillers, I will admit, and typing with my left hand and with my neck in a brace because I was just so determined. This is what I was going to do. It was this inevitable path I'd been on my entire life. Nothing could stop this. Cue 4 to 5 months later, 12 rejection letters, summarily rejected, even from Vanderbilt, the school that I was attending. I was crushed. I took that as a sign from the universe, not only that I wasn't a good writer, but that this identity that I had wrapped myself up in, this Ashley Winstead as a reader and a writer, that was false, that didn't exist, the universe didn't want me. I did what you're not supposed to do as a writer, and I took rejection so personally that I didn't write again for 10 years. I was so hurt and took it so seriously. I went off, I did cool things. I worked in the music industry, I worked in the entertainment industry, in TV, and then I got my PhD in contemporary literature. So I was always circling writing the way that Robin, you said that you were as well. It was like, okay, well, universe, if you're telling me I can't be a writer, I'll study writers, or I'll be around TV writers, or what have you. And it wasn't until I graduated with my PhD in contemporary American literature that I thought to myself, I wonder if maybe now I'm qualified to write again, to try this. And I had to tell myself that no one in the world was going to see this. It was going to be for me alone. I would show no one could reject me again. And I started writing. And this time, instead of writing about middle-aged men, I wrote about young women. I took parts of myself and I put them in my characters. And that was, I think, the game changer for me. I wrote a contemporary YA fantasy that got me an agent. And then that agent came back to me. I heard Sarah Penner say that she loves the edit notes. The edit notes are where my soul goes to die and shrivel up. So we are very different. And I got these edit notes on my YA fantasy from my agent, and I thought, what if instead of doing that, I just wrote a new novel? So I did. I wrote what would become In My Dreams I Hold a Knife. And I wrote it as an exorcism of, so that's how far I'd come from the old days of like trying to figure out what people wanted me to write, what I should be writing about, into In My Dreams I Hold a Knife. I poured everything I was ashamed of, all of my fears, and I just hoped and prayed, and made it into a murder mystery, and hoped and prayed that it would be, people would say like, oh yeah, I feel this way too. You're not alone. And that's the book that ended up making me a published author. So, yeah, not a book about failure and rejection. You write what you know, right? Yeah. Okay, so yeah, we're here to talk about. You're here to talk about With Prejudice, your debut, which is incredible, and I'm here to talk about The Last Housewife, which is actually my third book and my second thriller. So, tell us about With Prejudice.
Yeah, so I wrote it while I was a criminal prosecutor. I think I started it. I know 2017 because I recall it was shortly after Hillary Clinton lost, and I was trying my first murder at the time. I was preparing for the first murder case, and I really loved my job as a prosecutor, but it's a pretty tragic experience. You're always meeting people, everyone really in the courtroom at their lowest moment when something horrific has happened, and you're only trying to, make something horrible maybe slightly less horrible. And particularly as a prosecutor, sometimes you're one of the most hated people in the courtroom. You have the judge who's yelling at you, can be temperamental, upset. Defense counsel certainly, right, who's by design your opponent. And so there's that argumentative, combative relationship. There's the defendant and his family, right? Obviously, not too pleased with you at the time. But even victims who you're ostensibly on the same side as, might find what you're pursuing unreasonable, might want more than what the criminal justice system can provide. And so sometimes I used to call it joyless, but fulfilling, but sometimes really, not uplifting. But one thing it never was boring. And I thought to myself, I'm living this drama every day. There's a story there. There's something that I can sort of communicate and express to others about this moment that we find ourselves in a courtroom. It really is thrilling, right? You're actively listening to make sure that, when you have objections to the testimony that you're prepared. So by the end of it, it's so physically you're drained by the end of it because of that active listening, right? There are surprises in testimony that catch you off guard. There's the verdict, which is, stomach turning, to sit there and wait for it to come. And it's as the prosecutor, I get to go home. It's the defendant's liberty who's at stake, but you still sort of feel just as judged as him with the sentence that the jury is about to, the verdict that they're about to render. Did they believe you? Did they trust what you had to say? And why not? So it was itself a thriller. And so I decided, okay, let me write about that. And I came at it with a thesis, an argument that I wanted to make, a revelation about the criminal justice system that had come to me while I was working in it. And it was that we dress up the criminal justice system in objective terms about facts and truth, and that's what carries the day. But ultimately, it's far more arbitrary than that. There is really no objective facts because we're all interpreting those facts through our own lenses that have been created from our experiences, from our politics, from our lives, way up until that point. We talk about body cameras, the advent of body cameras, that was going to solve everything in terms of our issues with policing, right? Because a camera is objective, but the person, the human being watching the footage, they're not. You have the Rodney King beatings; those were captured on tape. But one set of human beings will look at that tape and they'll see police brutality, and another set of human beings will look at that tape and see a man resisting arrest. You think about climate change, you think about vaccinations. There are the facts that we receive, the ones that don't conform to our worldview often, we put those aside, and the ones that do reaffirm what we believe, we hold tight to. And so I wasn't quite sure what reform, and in fact, I didn't have a reform in mind. I just thought I needed to expose that truth about the criminal justice system before it can be fixed, before it can be reformed. There's research out there that the attractiveness of the attorneys can affect the verdict, right? Because that determines who you trust, who you believe. If you're used to a particular, authority figure, a certain, type of person, certain demographic, certain age, you might trust that person more so than an attorney from a different demographic group or age. So it's all those little things, it matters who you pick, who's on the jury, way more than the actual facts you're presenting to them. And so it's a common saying among criminal attorneys is that your case is won or lost at jury selection. You pretty much, you don't know it, but the verdict is somewhat written kind of in stone based on who you pick. Because again, they're gonna be filtering the facts as they see them through their own lenses. It's what makes us human, and I thought that was what I wanted to expose and show people, and that's why I wrote With Prejudice. What about The Last Housewife?
Yeah, The Last Housewife was my second book as part of my 2-book deal that I got to publish In My Dreams, I Hold a Knife. And so when and I'm sure you had this experience too, when you are writing what will become your first book, not only do you don't have any deadlines, which is nice and luxurious, but you are thinking constantly about, is this book gonna sell? Can I sell this, pitch this to a publisher? There's a lot of pressure. I felt a lot of pressure when I was trying to break in and get my first book published. And so with my second book, The Last Housewife, I had this moment where I was thinking about what I wanted to write, and I had this realization, like, oh my God, I don't have to sell this to anyone. Like, they've already bought this book. Like, suckers, they're in. So I had this feeling of immense creative freedom. Like, I could really just do what I wanted to do without worrying. Now, of course, you have to, present the book to your editor and the idea, and there are a lot of stages there. But I thought, okay, with the world at your fingertips, what do you want to write about? And I had, for 2 things came together in like a perfect storm. One was my entire life, I had had this idea that there was a thriller to be told simply in the experience of being a woman in the world. In stepping out of your front door at night, wondering to your car, walking through a parking lot, your keys gripped in your hands, maybe sticking out, and just trying to be super aware of where you are at all times. And this kind of like constant hum in the back of your mind as a woman of just like, potential danger lurking. And this is something that I had experienced since really since 11, 12 years old, because I hit puberty kind of young and had the experience of going from being, this is a very common experience for women, but going from being a kid to all of a sudden having more of a woman's body and receiving an onslaught of attention for that before I was prepared or knew what to do with that attention. And that felt like I was living in like a state of surveillance. Just all these things that really lended to a thriller kind of story. So I knew I'd wanted to tell a story that was somehow a thriller about being a woman in the world. And the second element of this perfect storm was the rise of the cult documentary. So you maybe have watched the NXIVM documentaries and read the NXIVM stories, followed the Sarah Lawrence sex cult story. I think a documentary was just released recently on Peacock, the Larry Ray story, who's the cult leader. I became absolutely fascinated by cults, and specifically about cults that didn't look like the cults I had in my head, people isolated from the world in Waco, Texas, or but people a cult operating in a city, kind of like operating under everyone's noses, maybe as even a legitimate business or a wellness group, which is very much like more the NXIVM story. And Sarah Lawrence cult operated, at Sarah Lawrence College under the noses of administration for many years. So I was just fascinated by this. Those things came together, and I thought, what if I wrote a book about a woman who was sucked into a cult, much like the Sarah Lawrence story, pulled herself out of it, but then had no choice later because her former best friend has been found dead under suspicious circumstances, than to put herself back undercover, really, in that sort of scenario of going back into the cult. And so I thought I can be I'll take as many risks and pull no punches, since this is my second book and they've bought it already. And so that's how The Last Housewife came to be, was this book that was marrying this idea I'd had forever, plus this current obsession. And I hope that it's a book that is about the way that just growing up as a woman is already an experience of indoctrination and conditioning, and learning to make yourself small and submissive in a lot of ways that really set you up for being for a lot of things. And I just took it to the extreme with this cult. So tell us how With Prejudice got published.
Yeah, so it was a years-long slog. The first book I ever actually shopped around was a book I had written about, loosely based on my mother's life. It was set in a fictional town in Ecuador. It was a sort of magical, realist look at 3 generations in a family, sort of converting the oral history that my mother had given me, taught me about her family, and writing it down, putting it in a literary fiction family saga. And I sent query letters to at least 300 agents, all rejected. I came somewhat close with the agent for Twilight, which I found funny, but it was a no-go ultimately. And yeah, it was, I thought to myself, okay, let me see if I can try something a little bit more commercial. It was, I'm a big fan of William Faulkner. I was, trying to write this sort of high-minded, stream of consciousness, magical realist. I felt like, okay, this might be like my hand at trying like a high school literature novel. Maybe I can try something that's gonna sell. So that was in 2017 then, when I was a prosecutor and decided, okay, let me try my hand at what I'm seeing every day. And I started in 2017 and I finished it 1 month into the pandemic, so in 2020, because the courts were closed down, and so I had all this time by myself in my apartment to write. So I finished it up, again, sent it out to a slew of agents, and it actually was, I updated the book about my mother, and that was the one actually that caught my agent's eye. I sent that one out again, sort of let me try with both. And we got on a phone call, that excited, agent call. It was going well, and he seemed to be into it. But right at the end, I just casually mentioned, I've written something else, not just this book about my mom. I've written, something about a murder trial in Miami, what I lived through every day. And he was like, oh, okay, send it to me. And he tore through it in that weekend, called me back and said, this is the one we gotta go out with. And at the time, it was the summer of 2020, so it was after the murder of George Floyd. And there was obviously a lot of interest in policing and criminal justice reform. And he just thought this perspective was one that is missing, a minority prosecutor, right? Someone on the side of law enforcement who had something, I hope, or at least he thought, interesting to say about race and criminal justice and the way, we navigate our own identities and subverting expectations and even the stereotypes also that we cement. And so we went out with that one. He signed me there, and again sent it out to multiple editors. And I recall the first rejection. He got a little spooked. My agent did. He sent it to a friend, and he was like, "Well, maybe we ought to. You should go through an editing process to make it sound more like a traditional legal thriller." That was the feedback he got, right? That it wasn't the traditional legal thriller. And I told him I didn't think it was appropriate, or what I wanted to do is shell out thousands of dollars in cash to make it sound more like other people. The traditional legal thriller that's has been cemented through history by people who don't look like me and don't have my lived experience. So the point was that it was supposed to be different and new and not in the same mold as previous writers have put that world. And so I told him, why don't we just keep trying? It's just the first one. I'm used to rejection, so I was like, it's okay. I soothed him a little bit. And we did. And the acquiring editor, Wes Miller, he read it, and I remember, or my agent forwarded to me the email he sent back when he was finished, and it was just one word. It was wow. And that feeling is all you need, right? You just need one person to believe in you. And so, I just, I think that story illuminates to me, don't give up. We're all flawed human beings, and the people on the other end of them are flawed, reading them are flawed as well. And so we shouldn't take those sorts of things personally. It's subjective, right? It's art. And just keep trying if it's something you passionately believe in, and hopefully someone will like it. And I was grateful and lucky that happened, and that's how I got With Prejudice published.
That's amazing. And I was going to ask you, one of my questions was, how do you handle rejection?
Yeah.
But amazingly well,
yeah.
apparently. Soothing your agent.
Practice makes perfect,
Yeah.
I think. And just, I try to be rejected as many times as possible.
Yeah.
So I can,
Well, unfortunately, I now have your phone number, so I can text you when I don't handle rejection well, and you can maybe help soothe me. Because I wrote my first book about how poorly I handled rejection. Just like, So, okay. I want to know about, I mentioned that Housewife was my second book in a 2-book deal. So I got my agent through an event called Pitch Wars. Is anyone familiar with that? A little bit? Yeah, so it doesn't exist anymore. But essentially it is a Hunger Games style battle between unagented writers to all taking place like on Twitter and online to get to agents. And so I thought, sweet naive Ashley, thought when I got into that program, and it's a mentorship program, so you're paired with agented writers who help you then reshape your entire manuscript and then present it to agents. And agents are supposed to flock, to you and request your manuscript and then sign you in a flurry. So I thought that was my golden ticket, and worked my butt off on my contemporary YA fantasy, completely revised it, had this brand new shiny manuscript. Then it was agent showcase time. And this is when you put little snippets of your manuscript plus the synopsis, the pitch up on a website. Agents come again. And I was so excited. I was like, this is finally, after years, this is going to happen for me, because I also did the multiple hundreds of querying sort of experience. I was like, finally going to happen for me. And the top writer in my cohort of Pitch Wars got 52 agent requests for her manuscript. I got 6. And all 5 of those 6 agents read my book and were kind of quickly like, no thanks, not for me. And so I had to kind of come to this reckoning with myself that, okay, yet again, you've put yourself out there, the world has said no, it felt like the MFA programs all over again. And so that's really like the seeds of where In My Dreams came from. So I thought, okay, well, as a writer, here I am, I've turned off all the lights in my house, banished my poor husband out of the house. I'm drinking wine out of the bottle. I'm eating ice cream out of a carton. And yeah, I'm gonna let myself have a self-pity night where I just feel really, really bad for myself. And I'm gonna think every thought that I'm not allowed to say out loud to anyone else, like, why didn't they choose me? I'm so jealous of everyone who's getting chosen. Like all the ugly things you're not allowed to admit. I'm just gonna think it all tonight. What could I do to get chosen? Could I, all those things. And that quickly turned into, what if there was a woman who didn't, empty her wine bottle out the next day and slap herself on the cheek and say, like, get back out there, but instead sank into these toxic feelings and really would do anything, go to any lengths to make the world respond to her, people respond to her in the way she felt she was due. And that was a seed of what would later become my main character, Jessica Miller, in My Dreams I Hold a Knife. So that is how I take rejection. Very, very poorly. We're on opposite sides of the spectrum there.
You created something great out of it, so I don't know that that's a good thing.
Thank you. Okay, so I want to dive into just your process.
Okay.
I was going to say we're both thriller writers, and I was going to ask you, in my bio, you heard that I'm also a romance writer. So inside me there are 2 wolves, and one writes thrillers and one writes romance. But I was going to ask you about other genres, but it sounds like you did start with others. So plans to write in other genres in the future?
Well, so I just announced yesterday that, publicly, that my second book is coming out in 2024. I'm excited about that. It's called, thank you, it's called One in the Chamber. And it is also a thriller, but it's a political thriller, so a little bit different, but still in the same family. It's about a U.S. senator found dead on election night, and the sort of junior staffers who may or may not have had a role in it. And it looks at sort of wealth and power, race and gender, those sorts of things in the workplace. So that's in the same vein. But as I mentioned earlier, I had written that book about my mom, was completely different. And I also have written some speculative fiction before, looking at our world, but just in the near future. So just a couple things changed because I'm interested in kind of throughout time what makes us human, what remains the same, and what things are malleable with new technology and as time progresses. But yeah, like I said, a thriller always felt very, at least at the time, the moment that I was living in, with the thrill of court every single day, it felt like a good way to kind of express that. And so.
See, this is incredible because a lot of times when I talk to readers or even talk to other writers and you say like, oh yeah, I'm a thriller writer, but also a romance writer, and I've written YA fantasy, and I have plans to write in other genres, I get like, what? Why? Or how? It's kind of you're seeing it more and more, I think, writers writing across genres. And of course, there are, Nora Roberts, very notable examples of people who have done it, but it's not typical. A lot of times as a writer, especially Robin and I both debuted rather recently. So we're still kind of up and coming writers breaking in, making a name for ourselves, you are encouraged to really find your niche and own it, find your space, and help create a brand for yourself. And when you debut with a really tense and dark psychological thriller, typically the industry advice wouldn't be to follow that up with a very funny, lighthearted, romantic comedy. But that is what I did. But I feel like I'm in good company with you because you're also writing across genres.
What made you do that?
Yeah, I have been, I have no control over my brain is the honest answer. And when I approach writing, it's always about characters. So every book I write, my ideas come to me as people. Like there was Jessica Miller before there was the rest of In My Dreams I Hold a Knife. There was Shay Evans for The Last Housewife, and same is true for my romance. It's always a story about a character who just won't leave me alone. Like I see her in the shower, I see her when I'm working out. She just won't leave me alone. And that's where I always start. And then I figure out what she has to say, what her life is like, and what her story is going to be like. And sometimes her story is full of murder and darkness, and other times it's full of second chance romance and self-empowerment. And so really it's down to the kind of characters. And I also just read voraciously, like we mentioned before, across genre. And I think when I was young, moving around a lot, I developed chameleon tendencies. So I developed, it felt like a survival need to be able to enter a situation and mirror whatever the vibe was of the people in the room. And I feel like that happens to me now as a reader and a writer. Whatever I'm consuming, I'm like, well, now I have a magical, like a fantasy voice if I've read, a couple things like that. So I just have this desire to kind of chameleon-like write as many different genres as possible. And we'll have an announcement that hopefully I get to make coming up soon about a new genre that I'll be dipping my toes in. But yeah, so okay, we have...
You are in the entertainment industry, that's a teaser, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yeah, stay tuned, watch this space, whatever professional influencers say. Yeah, so how we've got these all these different genre interests. Where do your ideas come from? Minor characters, what for you?
Yeah, I usually have a thesis, an argument that I want to make, and then develop a plot around that.
Such a lawyerly approach.
There you go. So, growing up, you always hear that adage, write what you know.
Yeah.
And I never did that as a kid. I just wrote about things I had no clue about. And usually it was just based on whatever I had last seen or watched or read. And I was like, oh, I want to do that. And so it wasn't very original to begin with when my first few stories as a kid. But now I try to very much do that. I try not to speak on matters I don't know about. I think there's a little bit of a sickness in our social media, society culture now where everybody kind of feels like they get to have a say about things, about sometimes topics we have no real, knowledge about. And I think sometimes it's better, there are people out there with that knowledge, with that skill set, and they should talk about that. They should put that out into the world, and I can maybe take a seat back and listen a little bit more. So I try to do that with the things I write, and usually, I want to say something with my writing, right? I don't want it to just entertain. I want to speak to something that's happening larger in the culture and society. And so a good example, that speculative fiction book that I wrote just came from the idea that, I was watching defendant after defendant, mostly male, and thinking to myself about testosterone and how, all the aggressiveness and, violence and recklessness that chemical can induce, and that sort of thinking like, what if there was a society that inhibited testosterone in men, and the women were in charge, were sort of first-class citizens, and men were second-class citizens, sort of like a reverse Handmaid's Tale. So I wrote that. I just was like, okay, it came from just that idea, and I sort of personally decided, what, I'm gonna vote for female candidates when I have the option, when I have the, over men. And I was like, okay, let me create that society for myself. That's basically what writing always has been to me as a kid. It was, when you're young, I think the word is emo that people say, right? You're very listless and yearning, and you don't know for what, but you're just, and you don't have a lot of control over many things when you're a minor, when you're a kid. And writing for me was a way to write out of that, to have control, to create a world of my own, to be in charge of my experience through writing and reading. And so I guess I still kind of do that to this day. If I'm thinking about a world that I either want to see or as I said, want to reveal something maybe dark about this world, I put it to paper and hope to share and express it with other folks. So yeah, it's usually centered on something I want to say, and then I come around and decide, like, how do I want to say this, and how do I make it have a plot, be entertaining, be interesting, and not just academic, right?
Yeah, didactic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I always struggle with that when I'm writing, because I approach my books similarly, in that there's always something that I want to say. There's always, and of course, ask any writer and you're likely to hear the same story. But, I've done a number of book events with writers, and I've asked them, so, what did you set out to do with X book? And I've heard enough times this kind of, oh, well, entertain. I want to, and I felt like a strange amount of shame in asking that question of other writers, because in that moment I've thought to myself, well, of course, yeah, that's what we're here to do, right? The important thing is that we're entertaining, and I always struggle when I'm writing and plotting my books, wondering, am I being too didactic? Am I writing a story to entertain and engage my readers, or am I trying to preach to them? And I try really hard to balance that and walk a fine line. But one thing I will confess is that writing for me, you say for you, it's always been like an expression of control and writing a world maybe that you want to see. For me, it's therapy. And it is one of the most powerful things that I have done to heal myself, is in my books, I always carve out or select or identify a part of who I am and my personality to put on the page and scrutinize with a magnifying glass, and make a really central core part of my main character's personality and journey. And I'm doing that, putting my main character on a journey of hopefully healing and acceptance with who she is, and the kind of, so with Jessica, it was toxic perfectionism. Jessica, in My Dreams I Hold a Knife, toxic perfectionism, and a kind of ruthless ambition that was really unbecoming. For my romance, my main character, Lee Stone, she was someone who wasn't careful with other people's hearts, had made a lot of mistakes in love, and didn't feel as if she deserved redemption. Or deserved love. And Shay Evans in The Last Housewife feels a tremendous amount of guilt over the way she has allowed patriarchal values, and literally this man in this cult, the leader of a cult, to shape her life so thoroughly, even to the point of her thoughts really being kind of conditioned in this way. So all of these are parts of myself that I have kind of taken out, put on the page, and really my books are, I joke that they're self-soothing exercises. Each one is me trying to convince myself, you're okay, you're normal. Well, maybe not, but you deserve love, and it's okay. So it's always a very intense writing process, I will say, for that reason.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sounds like there's a lot of you in your characters.
Yes. What about you?
So I didn't think so, but people keep telling me yes, my friends. You know, there's not always like a direct facsimile, you know, although again, they try to, like, is this character you, is this character me, that sort of thing. But I try to incorporate a lot of my personality, my life experiences, those that I've heard from friends, family, and acquaintances into the story, just because I think they're wild and interesting, and I want to share them with the world as well. I also don't know what it says about me, but I'm really fascinated with unlikable characters. You know, I just think that, you know, a lot of my favorite TV shows have characters that are deeply flawed. And I think that it may have something to do also with the way I was raised, original sin and all of that. I just really both find it interesting and fascinating, the sort of when we mess up, when we make mistakes, how it's in our nature to be flawed. But there's really a beauty in that to me that I try to focus on in my books. Yeah, beauty in falling short. That's the sort of things that I like to focus on in terms of building characters. But
Oh, I love that. So how do you develop characters? Like what does that writing process look like for you?
Well, in terms of the actual little, you know, there are some writers who say they plot out things, you know, they have outlines, you know, that are almost as long as the book itself, you know. I am not that organized, and maybe this is self-rationalization, but I think there's a reason for that, at least. I think for me, the advantage is I have an idea, I have a place that I know I want to go, but I want it to develop naturally and organically, and I want to sort of follow the book the way a reader would. So I know where I'm ending up, but I often do not know how I'm going to get there whatsoever. And I kind of just like dive in to the word processor and just sort of go along the journey. And a lot of it is developed, you know, halfway through, 3/4 of the way through, so that I kind of see it in the same way that the reader sees it, and I get a little bit of maybe it's selfish, a little joy and thrill at like a twist and a turn that I just developed, and I get really excited about it in the moment in the same way I hope that a reader would as well. So that's usually how I go about, you know, the writing process. It's again, not very detailed, organized, it's very organic, and it just kind of comes to me. What about for you?
Oh, I'm the complete opposite. Yeah. I have 45-page outlines for each of my books. And yeah, you like the process of discovery. I like the process of control.
There you go.
So before I can start drafting any of my books, I write out and plot basically every single chapter and scene by scene. And this is especially important to me when I'm writing my crime fiction, because there's nothing I love more as a reader than an intricately plotted murder mystery. And so it's important to me to try to create that for my readers. And so when I am creating a plot, especially for my thrillers, but I've got 45-page outlines for my romances as well. But it's like full murder board scenario, like, someone just like the strings all over the board, like this connects to this and then this happened, and color-coded outlines. Every plot through line gets its own color, so I can see the rainbow twisting together. I'm like, we don't have enough of their storyline. Let's do that. So it takes me a very long time to plot my books, because for me, that's where the creation, the majority of the creation happens, is in that process. That's when I have to take the long walks and the 45-minute showers, which I probably should admit to being wasteful. But that's when I have to do all the ideation. And then it's only when I have that structure in place that I feel like, okay, I'm free to write. Mm-hmm. I know where I'm going. And then I will surprise myself in the drafting process. Like I'll come up with things that are better than what I imagined in the plotting process. So I give myself freedom there. But yeah, I just am very, very methodical with that. And even before I get to the plotting, I follow, if there are any writers in the room or aspiring writers, the book Story Genius by Lisa Cron is an incredible resource. It's the book that I turn to at the outset of every single one of my novels. And it helps me, I think, draft quickly. So my first book, In My Dreams I Hold a Knife, came out in August 2021. By the end of this year, I will have published my 5th book. So I publish 2 books a year, and I will be for the foreseeable future. And this is an incredible resource for me for just lightning fast getting into the heads of my characters. And Lisa Cron has this theory that readers read not because they want to necessarily watch like some spectacular plot unfold, but because they're looking for that mirror experience of being inside someone else's brain and having that really pleasurable experience of getting to watch another person make decisions and have things impact that person. And just that kind of like, she takes a neuroscience approach to saying like, oh, this is why it's so pleasurable for your brain. And so I focus a lot on doing that character work, then the plot, then finally the drafting. So that's, when I get to drafting, it's like this big relief that I'm finally gonna get to write, let's talk about the publication, what the publication process has looked like. So your book came out in 2022.
That's right.
Last year. It's amazing. And I was mentioned that I debuted in 2021. So you and I have this rather unique experience of both being pandemic debuts. Uniquely terrible experience of being pandemic debuts. So what has it been like to have your book out in the world, especially within the context of, a lot of events like the one that we get to be at right now, shuttered for a while.
Right. Well, so, I don't know any other world but that. So it was nice in a certain sense. When I had that conversation with my agent, I had taken the month to go be with my sister and my nephews in Houston, actually. And I wouldn't have had that opportunity had I been full bore with a full court docket. And that lent me the opportunity to talk to my agent to get some advice from my sister and my brother-in-law about that whole process. And so in certain ways, it showed me, it reminded me that, this is something you love to do, and perhaps you should be putting more time into it and sending it out and seeing if you can get it published. So it kind of was the kick, the impetus to finish it up and really get it out there and put it out there. And in terms of just promotion after, the publication date, obviously there were a lot more events virtually, and I think that, anything that encourages more access to authors and pulls in people, right? Because it's a time commitment to come physically in person, and sometimes it's easier and to just log in with your bottom half casual and your top half presentable.
Yes.
And so I think it opened up those events to more people, and I think that is beautiful and great. And so I was pleased. You lose some of the human connection, right? And this is great to be here with everyone, and I'm glad we've gotten to a point where we can do this again. But I also think, I try to, see things glass half full, optimistically, and I think that there were some nice benefits to the fact that events were, transferred over online. How did it affect your process, your view of the whole thing?
I definitely agree that there were some silver linings in that. I got to do for In My Dreams, my debut, I got to do virtual events, in the state of Washington, right? I got to make connections with booksellers there, and do an event with an author who I probably normally wouldn't have gotten the chance to be in person with, right? So it did open a lot of opportunities, and I did really enjoy being able to go to these events in my pajama pants, and with a glass of wine in my Nukes cup, hidden in my Nukes cup with a little straw. So that part was absolutely great. But there are certain experiences that were foreclosed. Of course, like things like this in-person. In fact, for The Last Housewife was my first book tour because I published 2 books when both Fool Me Once and In My Dreams, when it was total lockdown. No one was having any events. And so for The Last Housewife, my 3rd book, I finally got to go out into the world. And it was such a nerve-wracking experience for me because I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be able to talk and readers are going to talk back. Like that's going to be, there's not just going to be this screen where I see someone. So hopefully I know how to talk to people in real life, that I've retained that skill, with trial by fire, I guess. So it has been incredible to now start to get all of those opportunities and to be able to make the connections with booksellers and librarians and that you kind of miss when we're all locked in our world. But yeah, so I'm just like, this has led me a natural segue just thinking about the future. What do you, in an ideal world, if you could paint your future career as a writer, in any way, what would your career look like?
Yeah. Well, so, for now I've really enjoyed the ability to have a day job where, because I both feel passionately about, exposing slices of the world that are known to me to other people, but to also actively trying to change it. And hopefully, some of my work has been helpful in that respect. And so I kind of get that balance, which is nice, the ability to, during the day, try to, serve my community. I've always only done public interest and plan to only do so moving forward. And then at night, I get to just sort of curl up and write, criticize the world as it is and sort of be a commentator on it and not just a participant. So that's been really great. And I think it also feeds into my sort of introvert, extrovert personality. I can have both. But I'd love in the future to be more like yourself, like to be prolific, to be able to just devote all of my time to my passion. It's never felt attainable to me. It always was a thing I did on the side, what I really loved to do, but it never was the thing I did to support myself. As much as I enjoy, as I said, how it's operating now, that would be nice maybe in the future to be able to just devote my life to the love of my life, which is writing.
Yeah.
What about for you? What do you envision in the next few years in your career?
That's so interesting to me because I became a full-time writer about a year ago now. And so for my first 3 books, including The Last Housewife, I wrote them nights and weekends while I worked at kind of a philanthropy/think tank in Houston, working on criminal justice reform and a lot of other issues. So I thought in my, all I wanted to do, this big dream was to be a full-time writer, and I achieved it. And I was so excited about that. I thought, oh my God, 2 books a year with a day job, 4 books a year with, full-time writing. Like, let's see what I can do. And I have to say, it has had the absolute opposite effect on me. Where before I had no choice. If I was going to be a writer and I was going to write books, I had 4 hours at night where I just had to do it. Now I have the whole day stretching out luxuriously in front of me, and it has kind of killed my efficiency. And so I'm not saying that the dream is not worth it and, to burst any bubbles, and this might just be a me problem. But yeah, it has been a struggle to kind of adjust to being a full-time writer. And in fact, I actually found that I had to completely shift my writing process. So what I was telling you all about the vast and meticulous outlining and the deep character work, I actually threw that out for the last book that I wrote, called Midnight is the Darkest Hour. It's my 3rd thriller. It'll be out in October. And I had to scrap my normal way of doing things, it just wasn't working. For the first time in my life, I experienced writer's block, and I could not get out of it. I had all the time and the resources at my fingertips, and I couldn't put words on paper. So I had to, I was ready to like invite, like crystal healers into my home, to do whatever, like expel bad spirits out of my writing space. I was ready to do anything, but what it ended up being is I had to just start writing scenes that approach the book differently, essentially, by writing scenes that I was interested in and then later connecting them to the book. So we'll see how it turns out with this. You guys can tell me whether it works or not for Midnight. But yeah, that should we, I don't know what our time is. Should we turn to audience questions?
Yeah, you've got about 5 minutes separate audience questions.
Oh, perfect.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry that we didn't leave much time. Yeah, would love to hear questions.
Back here?
Okay, yes. Sorry, it's hard to see.
It's Alvin.
Oh, hi.
So, Robin, I have a question for you. You said that the judgment is determined by the juries that are selected. Has a jury ever surprised you in real life?
In terms of their verdict?
Yeah.
All the time. Maybe I have too much confidence, because maybe I always went in thinking, well, as a prosecutor, you go in thinking that you can prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt, that this is somebody, you're certain by that point, you would not go forward with a prosecution, certainly to the point of trial, unless you're certain and you feel confident, and you have a lot more information than the jurors do. So my favorite thing is, and this is right, this is the way our justice system works, it's what's, because you don't want them to know someone's prior criminal history, right? So there's a defendant, right, who's been convicted of burglary of a dwelling 10 times over, the course of his life, right? So it's a thing he does. And the jurors are thinking about it, or thinking throughout the trial, oh, I guess this must be his first time, because no one's mentioning the fact that, what he did in his past. So then, you have, let's say, all this good evidence. There are cases where I've had, DNA, strong eyewitnesses, video. Oftentimes, unfortunately, also in the prosecution of sexual assault, I feel sometimes as though you can have all the proof in the world. And again, it's one of those things about where society is ready, what they're ready to criminalize, what they're ready to interrogate in terms of what happens in the bedroom. And so sometimes you'll get a not guilty that you're completely, flabbergasted with. And then afterwards, some of my colleagues and I, maybe while they were waiting, the jurors are waiting to leave, you overhear them talking about like, oh, well, I guess, he didn't have a history for this sort of thing. And you go up to them and you're like, well, actually, this is his 10th. And they'll say, how come you didn't tell me that? And it's like, because I can't. I'm not allowed to. Just trust me. I was up there, and I was trying to persuade you the best you can. But that's the way the system is. And so, yeah, there are a lot of shocks and surprises, verdicts that go completely. You can have the strongest cases that end up in not guilties, and some of the ones that you feel, a lot of evidence is inadmissible. Again, even though you're certain about the guilt, that the actual presentation itself is not as strong, and then they end up being guilty. So it really is about who you choose. You try really hard to pick people who are going to see the world through a certain lens, who are going to find what you have to say trustworthy and authoritative. And then it's the beauty of the system. You have no idea what's going on back there. It's a black box. And that's actually also why I wanted to write with prejudice, because the jurors are the most important person in the courtroom, but in most legal thrillers, they don't have a name, they don't have a face, we don't know who they are. They just render a verdict as if they're not the whole purpose of what's going on there. And who they are as people is what matters most. And so I wanted to tell a story about them as characters. Thanks.
Okay, will you come back and see us and tell us what you will think of the results of the trial that's going on in South Carolina?
Yeah.
You really can't find it right now, but it seems to be all over the place.
Yeah.
And are you glad you're not part of that?
Sure. Yeah, no,
So we'll expect to see you at the end of that trial.
Okay, perfect. I'll give my expert commentary. I have a lot of feelings and thoughts. So.
Okay.
Okay.
Will do.
Somebody down there asked the previous listener about how they, like, do you have to write in silence or in, noisy places, or, how does your, I guess, sensory toleration go when you're writing?
Yeah, so the question is about writing in what kind of atmosphere writing, silence or noise. And I, like Sarah, tolerate zero noise. My husband is in the crowd here, and he will be the first to tell you that if he steps too loudly, I'm like at the door, like, what's going on out here? I need absolute silence to write. Yeah, I can't listen to music, lyrics, mess up dialogue. I just need, so I am not a coffee shop writer. Unfortunately, again, for my husband, I've commandeered the living room now as my writing space. Every few months, I switch to a different part of the house where the energy is better. So he does not have use of the living room currently. Yeah.
I love writing to music. If it has lyrics, that's fine. I just, I get kind of pumped up with like kind of like when you're exercising. It's kind of nice to have a soundtrack to what you're writing. And so I don't mind that sort of, that noise. TV is a little much. That it's going to detract or take away my attention. But music is fine, and coffee shop writing is fine by me too.
Oh, jealous.
Who do you listen to?
What music do I listen to? Oh, I don't even know. Whatever's popular usually. Well, really old, like 90s and 2000s stuff, because that's what I grew up listening to. So.
Okay.
Do either of you have interest coming from Hollywood?
Oh, so the question is, any interest from Hollywood? So I will say The Last Housewife was optioned for a limited series by Netflix. So I'm excited, but again, cautiously excited because as you heard earlier from Sarah, a lot of things get optioned that then never go anywhere. But Netflix was excited that it could be a juicy and terrifying limited series. And so right now I'm actually working on some behind the scenes stuff with In My Dreams I Hold a Knife to also become a limited series. And the cool thing with that project is I've actually, the screenwriter who is attached to In My Dreams I Hold a Knife actually wanted my opinion about the script, which I found really rare and interesting. And so she and I would have Zoom calls where we would go over her pitch and the pilot episode that she had written for In My Dreams I Hold a Knife. Talking through ideas and arcs. So that was a really cool experience that I've talked to writer friends about who've said like, yeah, that wasn't at all what our experience was. And with The Last Housewife, it's been almost completely hands off. So that's where I'm at.
Yeah, I have some co-agents in TV and film who are looking to try. So if there's anyone out in the audience with connections. I'd love for it to be a TV show. But they're also really interested in the next thing I'm writing, and I think it's because, again, I don't know that people know a lot about the way the Capitol Hill works and the workplace dynamics there. There's a social media page. It's called Dear White Staffers, and it's, in essence, a bunch of staffers anonymously posting how horrible their bosses treat them. Thankfully, my boss now is a lovely and great person, so that he is not part of the problem. But, a lot of politicians are egomaniacs and don't treat their staffs so nicely. So that's where the idea came that I had been working on January 6th stuff, and I thought about the rise of political violence in recent times, and again, I like to subvert expectations. So a lot of the focus and talk has been on right-wing extremism. But I thought, how interesting would it be if like a set of progressive staffers got together and plotted to kill one of their bosses, particularly because of the sort of common knowledge it is on the Hill of some people and who treat their staffs poorly and aren't the best bosses. And so I think that sounds like a good idea for a TV show or a movie. So I hope that gets up there.
Sounds amazing, yeah. Thank you.